Matilda of Flanders was the queen of William the Conqueror. Her life was not an easy one, on occasion being on the receiving end of William's fearsome temper. On one occasion she is said to have been dragged outside naked after she had got on the wrong side of William. She, however, did hold her own, and when she passed away, William is said to have mourned her deeply. She also produced 4 sons for William, although one of them, Richard, died young. Matilda of Scotland was the daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, and she also had Anglo-Saxon blood running through her veins. This made her a logical choice of bride for Henry I. She was the mother of the Empress Matilda, who would go on to become one of the leading female figures in medieval history. Her death in 1118, though, proved to be quite fateful, even though Henry I might not have known it at the time. His son William Atheling was still alive, but he would drown in the White Ship sinking in 1120, and with Matilda dead, Henry I now had to try and sire another male heir, and so he would have to marry again, but this would prove unsuccessful. Adelita of Luvan was the second wife of Henry I after the death of Matilda. As I just mentioned, Henry I desperately needed another male heir to succeed him after his one legitimate son, William, drowned in the White Ship sinking. The marriage wouldn't produce any children, however, and Henry chose his daughter, Matilda, as heir. As Adelisa would go on to marry again after Henry's death, and produce 7 children, with her second husband, William de Albany, it is highly unlikely that the reason Henry I produced no children with her was of any fault of Adelisa's. In fact, Henry I should take responsibility for this himself, as he had 20 illegitimate children, with some historians even putting it at 24. If he had concentrated on producing more male heirs with Matilda, then perhaps the anarchy of King Stephen's reign would have been avoided. Matilda of Boulogne was the queen of King Stephen. King Stephen's reign was filled with civil war after he had usurped the throne from the daughter of Henry I, the Empress Matilda. During the struggle, Stephen relied on his wife, who proved to be a loyal ally, as she called upon resources from her Boulogne homeland to reinforce Stephen's ailing campaign and kingship. The war ended in stalemate, and Matilda died in 1152 and was buried at Faversham. Her and her husband's remains are now lost. Eleanor of Aquitaine's career and life is quite extraordinary. She rebelled against 2 husbands, divorcing her first husband, the King of France, Louis VII, and then rebelling against her second husband, Henry II of England, paying the price the second time by spending 15 years in prison. After she had been released, she went on to act as regent for her son, Richard I, and then was a critical figure in the early years of her other son, John's reign. Her life is absolutely extraordinary, and she is one of the most remarkable women in not just English history, but world history. Although the tomb of Eleanor and her husband and son survive, the remains were scattered at some point, possibly during the French Revolution, although I have seen stories that the bones were scattered during some rebellion during the 16th century. Berengaria of Navarre was married to Richard I. She is largely forgotten about as a queen, and it's said she never even stepped foot in England. She had been brought to marry Richard by Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, whilst Richard was still on Cyprus, heading for the Crusade. The marriage produced no children, and she is buried at Le Mans. King John was married to two Isabellas, Isabella of Gloucester and Isabella of Angoulême. After a decade of being married to Isabella of Gloucester, John decided that he wasn't happy with the marriage, and so had the marriage annulled, which caused a great deal of controversy, with Pope Innocent III being less than happy with John revoking his marriage. He went on to marry Isabella of Angoulême, who was about 12 or 13 when she married John, and she would be the mother of the future Henry III. Isabella died in 1245 and was buried at Fontevraud Abbey. Her remains, like those of Richard I and Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, have been lost. Eleanor of Provence was a woman that was despised by the people of London. The Queen of Henry III, her family benefited greatly from her royal marriage, and as a result, there were plenty of foreign visitors to the English court, and some who became very enriched. But in what I consider to be one of the funniest incidents in medieval history, Eleanor was travelling down the River Thames. When the Londoners saw her, they decided to pelt her with rubbish, in what is not exactly a royal way to treat a queen. Eleanor died at Amesbury Abbey, where she was buried in 1291. Eleanor of Castile was the beloved first wife of Edward I. A story goes that during the Ninth Crusade she saved the life of Edward by sucking out the poison from wounds he got from an attack by an assassin. Edward adored his wife, and he was distraught when she died, and he erected the Eleanor crosses as a tribute to her on the funeral procession to London. These can still be seen today. She died in 1290 and is buried at Westminster Abbey near her husband. Edward I's second wife was Margaret of France, a woman a lot younger than him, but again he was content with, and with who he enjoyed a good relationship with. Margaret also enjoyed a good relationship with Edward I's son, the future Edward II. That is, until he became blinkered with Piers Gaveston. Margaret died in 1318 and is buried at Newgate. One of the most notorious women of the age, Isabella of France led quite a life. Married to Edward II at an early age, she was on good terms with Edward on a personal level, but Edward's behaviour soon became unacceptable. He prioritised Piers Gaveston and then later on the Despensers and alienated Isabella. They did produce 4 children, but Edward's naive behaviour ultimately pushed Isabella aside and into the arms of Roger Mortimer. Isabella and Mortimer deposed Edward II in the name of Edward and Isabella's son, the now Edward III. It is generally accepted that Mortimer had the old king murdered at Berkeley Castle. However, Isabella and Mortimer's regency proved to be no better than Edward II's reign, and they began to act like tyrants. Eventually, the now 18-year-old Edward III decided to overthrow his mother and her lover. and he reached majority and became king. Mortimer was hanged and Isabella disgraced. She died at Hertford Castle in 1358 and is also buried at Newgate. Philippa of Hainaut, the wife of Edward III, was another queen, not only dearly loved by her husband, but also by the English people for her gentle and kindly nature. When she died, with her went a stabilizing force in Edward III's once mighty reign, and his reign descended into something of a shambles after Philippa had passed away. Both Philippa and Edward III are buried at Westminster Abbey. Anne of Bohemia was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and so represented a prestigious marriage for Richard II, and she became a wife that he cherished. When she died prematurely in 1394, Richard was overcome with grief, resulting in a violent outburst at her funeral, and he tore down the palace where she had died. She is buried at Westminster Abbey, alongside Richard. Richard's second wife was another Isabella of France. She was just a young girl when they married, aged about 6, with Richard approaching 30. The two seemed to have a good relationship, as far as you can in a marriage like that, until Richard was deposed in 1399. Isabella died in childbirth, aged 19, and she is buried at Blois in France. Joan of Navarre was the second wife of Henry IV, the first being Mary de Bohun, who died before he became king, but was the mother of his son and heir, the future Henry V. Joan married Henry IV in 1403, but didn't produce him any children. This may be because Henry was suffering from poor health, something with which he struggled with throughout his reign, and Joan would go on to have children after he had died. Joan was a good wife and a good stepmother to Henry's children. Joan died in 1437, and she is buried alongside Henry IV at Canterbury Cathedral. Catherine of Valois' first marriage to Henry V could have created history and united the English and French crowns, but Henry V died early, and that dream ended. However, Catherine's second marriage to Owen Tudor would be the beginnings of the Tudor dynasty. Their son Edmund was the father of the future Henry VII. Catherine of Valois is buried at Westminster Abbey. Margaret of Anjou was quite simply one of the strongest women in the medieval age. She was married to the simple Henry VI. Henry VI was totally incapable of governing, and so it was up to Margaret to try and cling on to the Lancastrian crown. After she had put up one hell of a struggle, including resorting to having to form an alliance with her deadliest enemy, the Earl of Warwick, Margaret's efforts ultimately proved in vain. Margaret died in relative obscurity in 1482, and she is buried at Angers Cathedral. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was extremely controversial. Her family was obscure, and it was expected of the king that he would make a marriage to a princess or well-connected woman. When he announced who his bride was, it caused consternation, not least with the Earl of Warwick, who had been in France negotiating on the behalf of the king. This was an embarrassment to the Earl, and so he was pushed over to the side of Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians in the Wars of the Roses, and so this marriage jeopardised Edward's throne. He could have lost it, but he just about got away with it. Elizabeth, though, died in 1492, having experienced tragedy. Edward the Fourth died in 1483, and her sons should have succeeded to power, with her oldest son, Edward, becoming Edward the Fifth. But his uncle deposed him, usurped him, and murdered him. Elizabeth Woodville was ultimately powerless to stop that. When she died, 9 years after her husband, she must have died a broken-hearted woman, having lost 2 sons to a man she might have thought she could have trusted, given Richard's loyalty to Edward the Fourth, his brother. Elizabeth is buried alongside her husband at Windsor in St. George's Chapel. Anne Neville was the queen of Richard III, with whom she produced one heir, Edward of Middleham. As a usurper, Richard's position was vulnerable, and Edward's early death at the age of about 10 was a critical blow. Like her husband, Anne Neville died in 1485, with Richard losing his crown at the Battle of Bosworth. Anne is buried at Westminster Abbey.